We begin tonight with the Burton man accused in the murder and dismemberment of his wife and how he had a long history of criminal behavior dating back to 1998, according to records from the Michigan Department of Corrections. Tony Roosevelt Roy's crime spree came to an end this week when he was shot by a Michigan State police trooper during a routine traffic stop in Detroit.
Saturday, July 15th, 2023. At about 7:20 that evening, officers with the Burton Police Department arrived at Kings Lane Apartments for what was entered as a welfare check. But this was not a routine visit. They had already been told that a woman might be dead inside one of the apartments. The officers went in. They moved through the residence and reached the bathroom. Inside the bathtub were 3 garbage bags. Inside those bags were human remains. The woman who lived there was nowhere to be found alive. Her husband was gone. The remains would later be identified as 41-year-old Shauna Roy, a mother of 2 whose family was about to be pulled into a nightmare with no warning and no chance to say goodbye. By the time police entered that apartment, the most important questions were already hanging over the case. What happened to Shauna before anyone came looking for her? How did her husband leave before officers arrived? And why, 2 days later, would the attempt to arrest him end with another woman sitting beside him while he held a gun? This case did not end with a confession, a trial, or a sentence. The man police believed killed Shauna would never stand before a jury. He would never be questioned in open court. And Shauna's family would never hear every answer they deserved. In this episode, we will follow the known timeline from the moment officers entered that apartment in Burton to the late-night traffic stop in Detroit. We will examine what police knew about Shauna's husband, how the search for him unfolded, and why his death left the case without the public reckoning a courtroom might have provided. Before we continue, subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories and tell us in the comments what city or country you are watching from. The discovery inside that bathroom was horrifying. But Shauna's story does not begin with 3 bags in a bathtub. It begins with the woman whose entire life was reduced, in the public record, to what police found after she was already gone. Before Shauna Roy became the woman found inside those bags, she was a mother living in Burton, Michigan. She was 41 years old. Her 2 sons were 16 and 7. To the public, Shauna's name would become tied to a bathroom, a police investigation, and a husband wanted for murder. But that was not how the people closest to her knew her. Her children knew her as their mother. Her friends knew her as someone warm, generous, and willing to help others. She was remembered as a woman who could laugh, dance, and bring comfort into the lives of the people around her. One friend later admitted that speaking about Shauna in the past tense felt almost impossible. The loss was too sudden, too violent, and too difficult to accept. 2 boys lost their mother. A family lost someone they depended on. Friends who had shared ordinary moments with her were now trying to understand how the woman they loved had become the center of such a brutal case. After Shauna's death, her sons were placed in the care of their maternal grandmother. Her oldest child was old enough to understand what had happened, yet still young enough to need the mother who was suddenly gone. Her youngest was only 7. Police were now searching for the person they believed was responsible. And he was not a stranger who had entered Shauna's apartment. He was the man publicly identified as her husband. The man at the center of the search was Tony Roy. He was 44 years old and publicly identified as Shauna's husband. They shared the Burton apartment where her remains were found, but very little verified information has been made public about their marriage. There is no reliable account of what took place between them during the final days of Shauna's life. That silence leaves a dangerous space, one that can easily be filled with assumptions. But the facts already known about Tony were serious enough. Burton Police Chief Brian Ross described him as a man with a long criminal history. That record included an armed robbery charge, and Tony had previously served time in prison. Those details did not prove what happened to Shauna, but once officers found her body inside the apartment and discovered that her husband was gone, his history became impossible to ignore. His absence by itself was not proof of murder. A criminal record was not proof either. But police were no longer looking at those facts separately. Shauna had been found dismembered inside the home she shared with him. Tony was missing. And the person investigators now needed to find had already experienced prison and had a record that included serious violence. Every hour that passed widened the distance between the apartment and the man who might know exactly what had happened there. Shauna, according to the background shared by those who knew her, believed in forgiveness and second chances. That part of her character matters because it shows the way she approached people. It should never be used to place responsibility on her or suggest that kindness caused the violence committed against her. The responsibility rested with the person who took her life. By the evening of July 15th, Shauna was dead. Her body had been cut apart and placed inside 3 bags, and Tony was no longer at the apartment. His past was no longer simply a chapter from years earlier. It was now part of the urgent assessment facing police as they searched for a man they believed had killed his wife and left her remains behind. There were still major gaps. Police did not yet know exactly how Shauna had died. They did not know how long she had been dead. They had not announced a motive. And Tony was not there to answer the questions now gathering around the apartment. The marriage that should have been the safest and most private part of Shauna's life had become the center of a homicide investigation. Yet even at that stage, the public knew far more about Tony's criminal history than about Shauna's final hours. Whatever happened between husband and wife remained hidden inside that apartment, until someone became concerned enough to ask police to look inside.
Matt, the details of this case are pretty gruesome. Police say Tony Roy, at the time of his death, was an absconder from parole. They believe he is the one responsible for killing his wife and then cutting up her body and placing her body parts in trash bags.
Before police reached Kings Lane Apartments, there was a stretch of time that remains largely hidden from the public. No confirmed account identifies the last person who saw Shauna alive. There is no publicly available detail showing when she was last heard from, whether she missed a planned call, failed to collect her children, or suddenly stopped responding to the people closest to her. The identity of the person who requested the welfare check was not released. Neither was the information that caused that person to believe a woman was already dead inside the apartment. That detail matters. Someone did not simply ask officers to check whether Shauna was safe. Police arrived carrying information that suggested they might find a body. Yet the public was never told how that information came to light. Did someone receive a message? Did Tony say something after leaving Burton? Had a relative been trying to reach Shauna for hours? Did someone enter the apartment before police arrived? None of those possibilities can be presented as fact because the available record does not answer them. The same silence surrounds Shauna's final hours. The exact date and time of her death were not immediately established. It was not made public how long her remains had been inside the apartment or how much time had passed between the killing and the welfare check. There is no confirmed account of a neighbor hearing a confrontation. No witness publicly described seeing Tony leave. No official statement explained how he traveled from Burton toward Detroit. And there is no verified evidence showing whether Shauna had previously contacted police, sought protection, or told someone that she feared for her safety. Those missing details do not make the case less disturbing. They make it harder to understand. Somewhere between Shauna's last ordinary moment and the arrival of police, her life ended inside the home she shared with her husband. Her body was then cut apart and placed into bags. By the time concern reached the Burton Police Department, Tony was already gone. The first point in the timeline that can be fixed with certainty is Saturday, July 15th, 2023. At approximately 7:20 p.m., Burton officers arrived at Kings Lane Apartments. They were not responding to a report of loud voices. They were not checking on someone who had simply missed a meeting. They had received information indicating that a dead woman might be inside one of the apartments. The officers approached the residence carrying that warning with them. They entered. Each step into the apartment brought them closer to confirming whether the information was true. Shauna did not answer them. Tony was not there. The silence inside the residence offered no immediate explanation for what had taken place. But the bathroom did. The information that brought police there was disturbing. What they found confirmed that the danger had already passed its final point. The officers had entered Kings Lane Apartments expecting to confirm whether a woman was in danger. Within moments, the nature of the call changed completely. They moved through the residence and reached the bathroom. There, inside the bathtub, were 3 garbage bags. The bags did not contain discarded clothing or household waste. They contained human body parts. At that moment, the welfare check became a homicide investigation. The apartment was no longer simply the home of a woman who could not be reached. It was now a crime scene, and every room had to be treated as a possible source of evidence. The remains would later be identified as Shauna Roy. She was 41 years old. She was the mother of 2 boys. And by the time police found her, The person who could answer the most immediate questions was no longer there. Tony Roy was gone. His absence became one of the first urgent facts confronting officers. Shauna's remains were inside the apartment the couple shared, but her husband was nowhere in the residence. Police now had to secure the scene, determine what had happened, and find the man they believed might know why Shauna was dead. The discovery raised questions that could not be answered by looking at the bags alone. How had Shauna died? When had she died? Had she been killed inside the apartment? How long had her remains been there? Had Tony left only hours earlier, or had he been gone longer? Police did not yet have those answers. What they did have was a scene showing that someone had taken further action after Shauna's death. Her body had been separated into parts and placed inside bags. The preliminary belief was that the dismemberment happened after she had already been killed. That distinction mattered. The dismemberment showed what happened to Shauna's body after death, but it did not reveal the act that ended her life. An autopsy would be needed to determine the cause of death and help narrow the period in which she died. Until that work was completed, there was still no confirmed answer to the most basic question in the case. What killed Shauna Roy? The apartment could provide physical evidence. The autopsy could provide medical findings. But neither could explain motive on its own. No publicly confirmed reason for the killing was announced at that stage. There was no verified account of a final argument. There was no surviving witness publicly describing a confrontation between Shauna and Tony. Then came the first major development beyond the apartment. Witnesses told police that Tony had told someone he murdered Shauna. The person who allegedly received that admission was not publicly identified. Police did not release the exact words Tony was accused of using. The public was not told when the statement was made, where it was made, or what led Tony to say it. But the allegation changed the direction of the case. Tony was no longer important only because he was Shauna's husband and missing from the home. There was now information from witnesses describing an alleged admission. That did not amount to a conviction. It did not remove the need for forensic testing. And it did not answer every question about how Shauna died. But it gave police a clear person to pursue while the apartment was being processed and Shauna's remains were being examined. The search for Tony became urgent. A man with a serious criminal history was missing. His wife's remains had been found inside their shared home. Witnesses were describing what sounded like an admission. And police still did not know where he was or whether he had access to a weapon. Inside the apartment, officers and evidence technicians had to preserve the scene and document what had been left behind. Outside it, detectives had to identify Tony's movements, determine who had seen or spoken with him, and work out where he might have gone. For Shauna's family, however, the case was no longer an investigation built from questions. It was a loss that could not be reversed. While the apartment was being secured and the search for Tony was beginning, two boys were about to learn that their mother would never come home. Her oldest son was 16. Her youngest was 7. They would not receive an explanation that night. They would not hear a motive, a confession in court, or a complete account of Shauna's final hours. They would only face the fact that their mother was gone, and that the man police wanted to find was her husband. This is where the horror of the discovery extends beyond the bathroom. The bags were evidence. For Shauna's children, they represented the violent end of the person who had raised them, comforted them, and formed part of their daily lives. For her friends, they marked the moment a woman they remembered as generous and warm became known publicly through the manner of her death. And for police, they marked the beginning of a search that would move beyond Burton and end in another violent confrontation. Which fact troubles you most? That someone already believed a woman was dead before officers arrived? That Tony was gone before they entered the apartment? Or that the exact events inside that home may never be publicly known? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. By the end of that evening, police had Shauna's remains, a crime scene, an alleged admission described by witnesses, and a name at the center of the investigation. What they did not have was Tony Roy.
That's when Burton police were called to the complex for a welfare check. Once inside the apartment, they discovered what they describe as garbage bags full of body parts piled inside of a bathtub. Police say the bags contain the body of Shauna Roy, the wife of Tony Roy. According to MDOC records, Roy's criminal history dates back more than 2 decades and includes 17 felony convictions, including several for armed robbery. Roy was paroled from prison last summer. In March of this year, while on parole, Roy was charged in Genesee County District Court with aggravated domestic violence, among other charges. The case was dismissed in April. The Michigan Department of Corrections listed Roy as an absconder on July 11th.
By Saturday night, the apartment at Kings Lane had been secured. Shauna's remains had been recovered, and Tony Roy had become the central figure in the investigation. But police still had to find him. The discovery had taken place at approximately 7:20 p.m. on July 15th. From that point, Burton officers spent the weekend working through the evidence inside the residence while detectives tried to establish Tony's movements. The two parts of the investigation were now running at the same time. Inside the apartment, the focus was on documenting the crime scene and preserving anything that might explain how Shauna died. Outside the apartment, the priority was locating her missing husband before he traveled farther or placed anyone else in danger. Investigators began speaking with people who might have information about Tony. They examined the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and followed evidence that gradually moved the search away from Burton. The trail pointed toward the Detroit area. That mattered because Detroit is approximately 75 miles from Burton. Tony was no longer believed to be close to the apartment where Shauna's remains had been found. The distance suggested that the search could not be handled only by officers working within Burton. Police needed help from agencies operating beyond the city. Every hour increased the pressure. Shauna had already been found dead. Witnesses had given police information indicating that Tony had admitted killing her. His criminal history included prior imprisonment and an armed robbery charge, and investigators still did not know where he was. At the same time, Tony had not been tried or convicted of Shauna's killing. Police believed the available evidence pointed toward him, but that belief still had to be tested through a lawful arrest, questioning, forensic examination, and if charges were filed, the court process. He remained a suspect. By Monday, July 17th, investigators had gathered enough information to obtain an arrest warrant. The warrant gave law enforcement the authority to take Tony into custody, but finding him remained the immediate problem. The search had now stretched across 2 days. During that time, Shauna's family was left waiting while police worked to locate the man they believed was responsible for her death. Her sons had lost their mother, yet the person at the center of the case had not been brought in to answer a single question. Evidence continued to direct investigators toward Detroit. Michigan State Police became involved in the effort to locate and arrest Tony. The search was no longer confined to a Burton homicide scene. It had expanded into a coordinated effort to find a wanted man moving through another part of Michigan. What police could not yet know was how the encounter would unfold when they finally reached him. Tony was not alone. Another woman was inside the vehicle with him, and the arrest warrant would not lead to a quiet surrender. A firearm would become central to the confrontation. That detail would bring a second woman into immediate danger and end any possibility that Tony would return to Burton alive to explain what had happened inside the apartment. Until that moment, investigators still had reason to believe an arrest could produce answers. Tony could be questioned. His account could be compared with the physical evidence. The alleged admission described by witnesses could be examined. The unanswered hours before the welfare check might finally become clearer. A prosecution could place the evidence before a judge and jury, giving Shauna's family a public record of what happened to her. But the case was moving toward a very different conclusion. Late on Monday night, Michigan State Police located the person Burton investigators had spent the weekend searching for. At 11:40 p.m., the search finally reached a vehicle traveling through northwest Detroit. But the arrest officers expected was not the ending they received. Michigan State Police located Tony Roy during a traffic stop in northwest Detroit, near Telegraph Road and 7 Mile Road. The man Burton police had been searching for was finally within reach. But Tony was not alone. A woman was inside the vehicle with him. Her name was not publicly released, and authorities did not establish what kind of relationship she had with Tony. She was described only as a female passenger or acquaintance. She had entered the vehicle with a man wanted in connection with his wife's death. It is not publicly known how much she understood about the investigation, whether she knew officers were searching for him, or whether she was aware of what had been found inside the Burton apartment. But within moments, she would be placed directly in danger. Troopers approached Tony with an active arrest warrant. The purpose was to take him into custody and return him to the legal process. He could have been questioned about Shauna. He could have been confronted with the physical evidence from the apartment. He could have been asked about the alleged admission witnesses had described. He could have explained when he last saw his wife alive and why he had traveled from Burton to Detroit after her remains were left behind. None of that happened. Tony produced a firearm. At first, he pointed the weapon at himself. The confrontation had now changed from an attempted arrest into an armed emergency. Troopers were facing a wanted homicide suspect holding a gun. Beside him sat a woman who had little room to separate herself from whatever decision he made next. Tony then moved the firearm away from himself. He pointed it toward the passenger. That action left the troopers with seconds to respond. Multiple officers opened fire. Tony was struck. The woman beside him survived. She suffered minor injuries from fragments of broken glass, but she was not struck by the bullets fired by the troopers. Tony Roy was pronounced dead at the scene. The man police believed had killed Shauna and left her dismembered remains inside their apartment would never be taken back to Burton. He would never sit in an interview room. He would never hear the allegations read against him in court. And he would never be required to give an account of what happened to his wife. The officer-involved shooting was referred for investigation, as required whenever police gunfire results in a death. Authorities would have to examine the actions taken during the stop, and the immediate threat created when Tony pointed the weapon toward the woman inside the vehicle. But for Shauna's homicide investigation, the most important consequence was already clear. The only suspect publicly identified by police was dead. For nearly 2 days, investigators had worked toward this moment. They had processed the apartment. They had recovered Shauna's remains. They had spoken to witnesses. They had followed information from Burton toward Detroit. They had obtained an arrest warrant. And they had involved Michigan State Police in the effort to bring Tony into custody. Now, at the exact moment law enforcement finally reached him, every possibility of a courtroom explanation disappeared. The questions surrounding Shauna's final hours remained unanswered. Police could no longer ask Tony when she died. They could not ask what caused the confrontation. They could not ask why her body was cut apart. They could not ask why her remains were placed in bags and left in the bathtub. They could not ask who knew what had happened before the welfare check. They could not ask how he traveled away from Burton or why another woman was with him in Detroit. Any explanation he might have given died with him. For the woman in the vehicle, the encounter ended with minor injuries and survival. For the troopers, it ended with an armed suspect dead at the scene and an investigation into the use of force. For Burton police, it ended the search for Tony but opened a different problem. How to complete a homicide investigation when the person they believed responsible could no longer be interviewed, charged, or tried. And for Shauna's family, the ending offered none of the closure they might have expected from an arrest. Tony's death did not tell them how Shauna spent her last hours. That is the painful contradiction at the center of this case.
Michigan State Police say their fugitive teams pulled over Roy's car in Detroit. When they did, the troopers say Roy first pointed a gun at himself and then at a female passenger, prompting troopers to open fire, shooting and killing Roy. And the officers involved in the shooting are currently on administrative leave while an investigation is underway. Matt?
Because Tony died during the attempted arrest, the case could never move through the normal stages of prosecution. That did not mean the investigation stopped. Detectives still had to determine whether the evidence truly supported the conclusion that Tony was responsible. They had to compare witness accounts with the physical findings inside the apartment. They had to examine Shauna's remains, review the circumstances surrounding Tony's departure, and confirm that no other person had taken part in the killing or the disposal of her body. Burton Police Chief Brian Ross made it clear that the department would continue working to ensure the facts were correct and that another person had not been overlooked. That work was essential because Tony's death removed the possibility of questioning him directly. Tony's death ended the possibility of prosecution. It did not answer how Shauna died, why she was killed, or what happened during the unrecorded hours before police reached her home. When the investigation ended without a trial, Shauna Roy's family was left with grief but no courtroom resolution. Shauna was 41 years old. She was the mother of 2 sons, ages 16 and 7. Her children lost the woman who had been part of their daily lives, while her relatives were denied the chance to hear the evidence presented before a jury. There was no verdict. There was no sentencing hearing. There was no moment in court when the full weight of Shauna's loss could be placed on the record. Her friends were left facing the same painful reality. One friend struggled even to speak about Shauna in the past tense. The woman they had laughed with, danced with, and remembered as generous and helpful was suddenly being discussed through the details of a homicide investigation. The public learned where her remains were found. They learned about the bags in the bathtub. They learned about Tony's criminal history, the arrest warrant, and the traffic stop that ended with his death. But far less was made public about Shauna's life before the crime. The exact cause of her death was not initially released in the available coverage. The motive remained unclear. Tony never faced questioning in court, and the private events that took place before police entered the apartment were never fully explained in public. That leaves a danger in how this case is remembered. Shauna's name could become tied only to a bathroom, 3 garbage bags, and the man police accused of killing her. But Shauna Roy was not the apartment police entered. She was not the evidence left behind. She was a mother, a friend, and a woman whose life belonged to more than the man accused of ending it. Share this episode so Shauna is remembered by name, not only by what was done to her. Subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories, and leave a respectful message for the family and the 2 boys who were forced to grow up without their mother. This is Dark Trace Crime Stories, where we follow the evidence, confront the darkness, and remember the lives behind the headlines.